A black teacher discovered that grades had been altered. But when she demanded answers, the only response she got was, "Stay silent if you want to keep your job." But justice isn't something that can be bought. And Sophia made her choice. She would fight, no matter the cost, because, as Martin Luther King Jr. once said, freedom is never given. It must be fought for. Sunlight streamed through the classroom windows, casting a warm golden hue over the neatly arranged desks. Sophia Bennett stood at the front, chalk in hand, her eyes burning with conviction as she looked at her students, who listened intently. Inflating, the greatest stories, the hero always fights for justice. No matter how long it takes, the truth will prevail. A few students nodded. Others jotted down notes. The air was peaceful, filled with hope. This was why Sophia loved teaching. In this classroom, every student was equal. Here, intellect and effort determined their future, not wealth, not privilege. A soft vibration broke the silence. Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at the screen. An anonymous message. "Don't believe what you're saying. Justice is nothing but a joke." She froze. A cold shiver crawled down her spine. Her eyes swept across the room. No one looked suspicious. The students were still, focused, scribbling in their notebooks, as if nothing had happened. But the unease clung to her as she walked down the hallway after class. The faint scent of floor polish lingered in the air, her footsteps echoing against the marble tiles. Just as she passed the faculty lounge, a voice, deep, authoritative, drifted through a slightly open door. "I don't care what his real grades are. We can't let the school's reputation suffer. Fix it." Sophia stopped mid-step. She shifted slightly, peering through the gap in the door. Principal Richard Calloway sat behind his desk, tapping his fingers lightly against the polished wood. Across from him sat a well-dressed, middle-aged man, a Rolex glinting under the dim yellow light. "But if the grades are too inflated, won't it be obvious?" A faint smirk crossed Calloway's face. "The school's reputation comes first. If you want to keep your job, it's best not to ask too many questions." The man slowly placed a thick envelope on the desk. "I believe this will help you think more clearly." Calloway eyed the envelope, his fingers tracing its edges, as if measuring its weight. A beat of silence, then a nod. Sophia held her breath. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to burst in, to demand answers, to expose everything right then and there. But reason held her back. Without proof, she would be nothing but a paranoid fool. Her fingers curled into a fist. She turned away, walking briskly down the hall. But inside, a storm was raging. Doubt spread through her, burning every thought in its path. Justice was never guaranteed. Maybe it had never existed at all. Doubt shadowed Sophia the entire day. The image of that envelope sliding across the desk, Calloway's calm yet commanding voice, it all echoed in her mind. That afternoon, she stepped into the teacher's lounge. Unlike the bustling hallways and lively classrooms, this place always felt subdued. A few teachers sat scattered around, some typing away at their keyboards, others flipping through papers, but no one really spoke. She had noticed this long ago, the unspoken tension, the invisible rule everyone understood, but never dared to name. Taking a seat at her desk, Sophia powered on her computer and logged into the grading system. Everything seemed normal at first, but as she scanned through the student roster, one name caught her eye: Michael Carter, one of the most troublesome students in school. Constant absences, half-hearted assignments, a history of defiance. And yet, according to the system, he ranked among the top scorers in the class. Her heart pounded. She pulled up his latest essay, the one she remembered grading herself. It was a jumbled mess, barely a few disconnected paragraphs. She had given it a D+, but on the system, the grade read A. She scrolled further. More names, more discrepancies. There was no doubt now. The grades had been altered. Sophia turned to the desk beside hers, where David Thompson, the math teacher, was focused on his screen. "David," she said, keeping her voice steady, "have you noticed anything off with the grades lately?" David stiffened just for a second, before his expression smoothed over. He clicked his mouse a few times, pretending to be busy. "What do you mean?" Sophia lowered her voice. "I'm seeing grades being changed, not just for one student, for a lot of them." David glanced around the room, then back at her. His voice was barely a whisper. "Sophia, you're digging into something you shouldn't." "Why?" David didn't answer right away. He let out a slow breath, then murmured just loud enough for her to hear. "Don't get yourself into trouble. Sophia, you have no idea what happens to people who ask too many questions." A chill ran down her spine. She wanted to press him further, but he had already turned back to his screen, shutting down the conversation. Sophia looked around the lounge. A few teachers had been watching her. When their eyes met, they quickly looked away, burying themselves in their work. No one looked surprised. No one asked questions. They knew. They all knew. And they chose silence. The realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. She wasn't just uncovering a case of fraud. She was standing against a system that had been rotting from the inside out. Shock clung to Sophia for the rest of the afternoon. The averted gazes, the suffocating silence in the teacher's lounge, David's veiled warning, it all felt like a thick, hazy curtain concealing a far darker reality she had only just begun to glimpse. She knew she had to do something, but before she could act, the principal's secretary appeared at the door. "Ms. Bennett," the woman said, polite yet cold. "Principal Calloway would like to see you." A chill ran through her. Every eye in the room turned to her. Some teachers quickly looked away. David Thompson gave a subtle shake of his head. A silent warning. "Don't go." But she had no choice. The door to Calloway's office clicked shut behind her, the sound sharp and definitive, like the closing of a trap. The room was vast, lined with polished mahogany furniture and bookshelves crammed with thick encyclopedias. A massive portrait of a former principal hung on the wall, his painted eyes seeming to follow every movement. And in the center of it all, Richard Calloway sat in a leather chair, perfectly at ease. "Ms. Bennett," he greeted her, a smile on his lips, but not in his eyes. "Please, have a seat." Sophia sat, keeping her back straight. Calloway tapped his fingers lightly against the desk, his unreadable gaze locked onto hers. "You're a good teacher," he said calmly, "but you need to understand how this system works." Sophia held his stare. "Works?" Calloway leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "The system isn't perfect, but it functions. It upholds the school's reputation, secures essential funding, and ensures a future for hundreds of students. Isn't that its own kind of fairness?" Blood pounded in her temples. "Fairness?" she repeated, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We're changing grades. We're turning failing students into top achievers on paper, because their parents can pay for it." Calloway chuckled, a soft, calculated laugh. "Sophia, who told you education was fair?" She didn't answer. The principal leaned back, studying her. Do you really think the country's top schools accept students solely on merit? That poor kids, no matter how brilliant, have the same opportunities as the children of the powerful? He laughed again, as if speaking to a naive child. No, Sophia, fairness is a lovely idea, but it isn't real. This system was built by the powerful, for the powerful. And if you want to stay in it, you need to learn how to play along. Her hands clenched in her lap. Every word felt like a nail being hammered into her resolve. So what do you expect me to do? Pretend I don't see it? Follow orders? This time, Calloway's smile deepened. Now, you're catching on. Outside the window, the sun dipped below the skyline, bathing the office in hues of orange and red. Sophia felt as if she had just signed an invisible death sentence. I won't do it. Her voice was firm, despite the turmoil inside her. Calloway studied her for a long moment. Then he sighed, the way a father might when his child refuses to listen. Ms. Bennett, you're a talented teacher. I truly hope you don't put yourself in a position you'll regret. Simple words. But the threat was unmistakable. Sophia took a slow breath and rose from her seat. She didn't say goodbye, didn't look back. She stepped out of the office, feeling as though she had narrowly escaped a snare, yet unsure if she had really escaped at all. The door shut behind her, sealing her off from the world of the powerful. And in that moment, she knew the fight had begun. Sophia left the principal's office with a chill running down her spine. That wasn't just a conversation between a teacher and her superior. It was a warning. A line had been drawn, and if she crossed it, the consequences would be beyond her control. The hallways of the school no longer felt familiar. Everything looked the same. White walls, bulletin boards filled with event schedules, students laughing in clusters, but there was something darker lurking beneath the surface. It was as if the entire building was hiding a secret no one dared to speak aloud. She couldn't do this alone. She needed someone who could give her real answers, and she knew exactly who to ask. That evening, storm clouds gathered, signaling late rain. Sophia stepped into a small cafe on the corner of the street, where the glow of warm yellow light reflected off simple wooden tables. The scent of freshly ground coffee filled the air, but it did nothing to ease the tension in her chest. David Thompson sat in the back, his expression hardening when he saw her approach. He didn't look surprised. He must have known she would come. Sophia pulled out a chair, placing her hands flat on the table to steady herself. I need to know the truth. David didn't respond immediately. He stirred his coffee, watching, the liquid swirl as if calculating how much he should say. Finally, he sighed. Do you know how many people like you have come before? He asked. Young, passionate teachers who thought they could change the system? Sophia held her breath. One of them tried to speak up. David paused, then met her eyes. And she disappeared from education. Sophia froze. What do you mean? David set his spoon down, the soft clink of metal against ceramic echoing emptily. A chemistry teacher. 3 years ago, she discovered the same things you did. She filed reports, reached out to the press. He hesitated. Then, suddenly, she was fired. He exhaled slowly. No school would hire her after that. Her record was spotless, not a single blemish. But every job application was rejected. No explanation. Sophia's stomach twisted. This isn't just about one school, Sophia. This is a system. Do you really think anyone cares about justice? David's voice was bitter. They care about money, about power, about keeping everything under control. Sophia clenched her fists under the table. She had suspected this, went deeper than a few altered grades. But she hadn't realized just how deep. How long have you known? David gave a hollow smile. Long enough to know it's safer to stay quiet. Sophia shook her head. But if we all stay quiet, who's left to speak up? David studied her, something flickering in his gaze. Pity, perhaps. Or admiration. I once thought I could change this too, he admitted. But I'm not willing to lose everything. She didn't blame him. She understood the fear, but she couldn't turn away. Outside, the first raindrops hit the pavement. Sophia inhaled deeply. Someone had tried to expose the truth before, and failed. That only meant she had to do better. She had no choice now. She needed proof, and she would find it. No matter what it took. The rain had stopped by the time Sophia left the cafe, but the New York sky remained a heavy, oppressive gray. She walked briskly down the sidewalk, her shoes splashing through puddles, sending ripples across the surface. There was no room for fear now. David Thompson could be afraid. He could choose to look the other way, but she wouldn't. If this system ran on money and power, then proof was the only thing that could expose it. And she knew exactly where to find it. 11:47 p.m., Callaway High School. The hallways were shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by a few dim security lights, casting long, eerie streaks across the marble floor. A place once familiar now felt cold, sinister. Sophia stopped in front of the IT room, where the school's grading system was stored. She scanned her surroundings. No one. Her pulse pounded as she pulled out a key, slipped it into the lock, and pushed the door open. Inside, the glow of idle computer screens cast an eerie blue light, their silent hum blending with the sound of her own racing heartbeat. She sat at one of the workstations, fingers trembling over the keyboard. The system required a password. No problem. She had once caught a glimpse of a technician entering it, just enough to recognize the structure. First attempt, incorrect. Second attempt, still wrong. A drop of sweat traced down her temple. She bit her lip, forcing herself to recall every digit, every letter. Third attempt. The screen flickered, then unlocked. She dove into the grade management files. Rows of numbers filled the screen. Doctored grades, manipulated records. Students with powerful parents conveniently ranking at the top. It was all here. She plugged in a USB drive, initiating the transfer. Every passing second felt like a blade pressing against her skin. 50%, 70%, 90%, 99%. Suddenly, the screen flashed red. Unauthorized access detected. Alerting administrator. Sophia froze. Her hand darted forward, yanking the USB free and stuffing it into her pocket. And then, footsteps. Steady, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. Someone was coming. Her breath hitched. She scanned the room. Nowhere to hide. The footsteps grew closer. She killed the monitor, slipped out of the chair, and backed into the shadows behind a row of server racks. Pressed against the cold metal, she held her breath. The door swung open. A blinding beam of hallway light spilled into the room, illuminating the rows of computers. A man's silhouette filled the doorway. Sophia stayed deathly still, heart hammering so violently she feared it would give her away. The figure lingered, eyes sweeping the room. The silence stretched, suffocating. Then, after a long, agonizing moment. The door closed. The footsteps faded down the hall. She waited, a few seconds before daring to exhale. She had the evidence, but someone knew she was looking for the truth, which meant she was being watched. Sophia left the IT room, her hands still ice-cold, the USB drive in her pocket feeling like a ticking time bomb. She had crossed a dangerous line, and whoever had entered the room right after her, whoever they were, had surely realized something was wrong. She needed to move fast, but before she could even make a plan, the next morning, she was summoned to an emergency meeting. No official email, no prior notice, just a staff member stepping into her classroom mid-lesson, whispering in her ear, "The principal wants to see you." Now, 11:45 a.m., parent conference room. The room was spacious but suffocating. Dim overhead lights casting dull shadows that did nothing to warm the air. A long table, covered in crisp white linen, sat in the center, surrounded by black leather chairs. No windows, no escape. Richard Calloway was already seated at the head of the table, as if he had orchestrated every moment leading up to this. Beside him sat a group of high-profile parents, figures she recognized from school fundraisers, men and women whose donations kept the institution running. And next to them, a man in a gray suit, his expression unreadable. A lawyer. The door clicked shut. Behind her, she was trapped. "Take a seat," Calloway said. His voice was calm, yet it swallowed the room whole. Sophia pulled out a chair, steadying her breath. Calloway slowly opened a black folder, flipping through the pages with long, deliberate fingers. Then he looked up, meeting her gaze. "Mrs. Bennett, do you realize that making false accusations against the school is a serious offense?" The words were smooth, razor sharp. Sophia didn't respond immediately. Her eyes flickered to the table, where a document had already been prepared for her. "This," Calloway continued, "is an internal review of your recent behavior. I suggest you take a look." She flipped the first page. Her stomach dropped. The accusations were endless. Disrupting workplace operations, unauthorized access to school systems, ethical misconduct. The evidence was airtight. Screenshots of system logins from the night before, anonymous complaints from supposed concerned colleagues, even a fabricated letter accusing her of damaging the school's reputation. Her fingers curled into fists. She had expected retaliation, but she hadn't expected them to be this prepared. "We know you accessed the system," a voice said. Sophia looked up. A powerful-looking man in a tailored suit, one of the wealthy parents whose child's grades had been falsified. His tone was final, like a judge delivering a verdict. "If you still want to teach," he said, "you'd be wise to forget all of this. No shouting, no threats, just a simple offer, a command dressed as a choice." The air in the room thickened. Every pair of eyes was on her. She scanned their faces. Calloway, patient, like a strategist waiting for his opponent to make a fatal mistake. The parents, smug, knowing the system was rigged in their favor. The lawyer, indifferent, as if this was just another routine case in a long day of work. David's words from the cafe echoed in her mind. "I once thought I could change this, but I wasn't willing to lose everything." Now, she understood his fear. Because this system didn't just protect the powerful, it crushed anyone who stood against it. She could just nod, just stay silent, just pretend none of this had happened, and she could keep her job, her career. She could walk out of this room unscathed, but she couldn't. Her nails dug into her palms. A decision formed in her chest, like steel locking into place. She lifted her chin, eyes unwavering. No, one word. But it carried the weight of everything. Sophia's final words still echoed in her mind as she walked out of the conference room. No, one word. But it was the line separating her from the corrupt system Calloway had tried to force her into. They had anticipated her defiance. They had come, prepared to destroy her reputation and career. But what they didn't know was that she had come prepared too. Her fingers tightened around the USB drive in her pocket. The proof was in her hands, but she couldn't take down an entire system alone. She needed someone who could bring the truth to light, and she knew exactly where to go. On scene high 9 Candief 9 Turturin, Rituin Sananardiman. 2 p.m., a cafe in Lower Manhattan. The neon lights from the bustling street outside reflected against the cafe's glass windows, casting a cold blue glow over the dimly lit space. The soft clinking of coffee cups and hushed conversations filled the air, but Sophia barely registered any of it. She sat at a small table in the corner, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. Everything could change after tonight. A man stepped inside, his dark trench coat still damp from the misty air, carrying an old leather briefcase. Ethan Brooks, a veteran investigative journalist known for exposing some of the biggest scandals in finance and politics. It had taken her all day to track him down, and the moment she mentioned grade fraud and elite private schools, he had agreed to meet her immediately. Ethan slid into the seat across from her, pulling off his gloves. His sharp, watchful eyes assessed her the way a man accustomed to spotting liars would. "I hope you have something worth my time," he said, his voice rough from years of cigarettes and sleepless nights. Sophia didn't hesitate. She pulled the USB drive from her pocket and placed it on the table between them. "Everything is in here." Ethan picked it up, pulled out his laptop, and plugged it in. The screen's glow reflected in his dark eyes as he scrolled through the files. Student records, altered grades, internal emails between administrators, financial statements showing anonymous donations from wealthy parents. The cafe's background noise faded as Ethan silently reviewed the evidence. After a long moment, he looked up. Gone was the initial skepticism, replaced by sharp, focused determination. If this is real, he closed the laptop and leaned forward. "You do realize you're putting yourself in danger?" Sophia nodded without hesitation. "I'd rather lose my job than live a lie." The words weren't just for Ethan. They were for herself. Ethan studied her for a moment. Then he gave a single nod. "All right, let's get to work." 7 M.E. I'm key. The dirt. Next morning, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, NBC News. Headlines flooded every major media outlet. Elite NYC private school rocked by grade-fixing scandal. Calloway High exposed. Bribes for better grades. Private education is a fairness only for the wealthy? On the front page of the New York Times, a single image. The iron gates of Calloway High, shot from below, looming like a fortress built to guard dirty secrets. Beneath it, a quote from Ethan Brooks' investigative report citing an anonymous insider. "I couldn't stay silent any longer. Students are being turned into pawns for money and power. Justice isn't given. It has to be fought for." No one knew the source's identity, but Sophia did. And now, Calloway had nowhere left to hide. The media storm hit Calloway High like a tidal wave. Sensational headlines from every major news outlet transformed the once elite institution from a symbol of power into the center of a nationwide scandal. That morning, it was anything but a normal school day. By sunrise, the school gates were swarmed with reporters, flashing cameras, and microphones shoved toward anyone who walked by. Police cars lined the streets, while Education Department officials arrived, their faces unreadable as they prepared to dig through every file, every record, every altered grade in search of the truth. Inside, tension suffocated the hallways. Students whispered in frantic clusters. Teachers huddled together, speaking in hushed tones, glancing around as if awaiting orders from above. But this time, no one could save Calloway. 10:30 a.m. The principal's office. Richard Calloway sat behind his mahogany desk, but for the first time, his usual calm authority had cracked. Across from him, two Education Department investigators flanked by the school's desperate-looking attorney. "We've reviewed the grading system," one investigator said coolly. "There is overwhelming evidence of unauthorized alterations. Multiple faculty members have also come forward." Calloway folded his arms, masking his unease beneath a smirk. "You're basing this on a tabloid hit piece?" he scoffed. "There's no proof I ordered anything." The investigator smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Is that so? Then, perhaps you'd like to explain these emails?" He slid a thick file across the desk. Calloway flipped it open and froze. The internal emails. Every instruction he had ever given. Black and white. Undeniable. Fix Michael Carter's grades. We can't have a major donor's son failing. Make sure these transcripts look clean before submitting to admissions. I don't care if he's actually talented. Just do what needs to be done. His own words laid bare. Everything exposed. For the first time, Calloway leaned back in his chair, his face blank. The realization sank in. He had lost. Outside the office, the fallout. Begin's word spread like wildfire. Furious parents flooded the school, their voices rising in outrage. "We pay hundreds of thousands for this, and this is how you run things? What will happen to my child's future if this school is investigated? I swear to God, I'm suing all of you." Students sat frozen, eyes glued to their phones, scrolling through article after article, reading the firestorm of comments flooding social media. Some laughed, bitterly, having long suspected the truth. Others sat in stunned silence, realizing their perfect transcripts might be nothing more than a well-dressed lie. In the faculty lounge, teachers who had once kept quiet finally began to speak up. Hushed whispers turned into open debates. Some, those who had played along, slipped out quietly, knowing their careers might be over. The entire foundation of Calloway was crumbling. 11:45 a.m. The final verdict, an emergency board meeting, was held. The school's investors, major donors, and board members all gathered. A closed-door tribunal, with Calloway trapped at the center of a storm of accusations, and in the end, Richard Calloway was fired. No severance, no farewell speech, no exit on his own terms. He left the building without a word. A man who had once held power in his grasp, now reduced to a shadow of his former self. 12:30 p.m. Outside the school gates, Sophia stood in the school courtyard, watching the chaos unfold. She felt no satisfaction, only a strange, hollow emptiness. Justice had won, but the price had been steep. Calloway High might shut down entirely. Innocent students would be caught in the wreckage. The corrupt players had fallen, but the system remained intact. David Thompson approached, his voice tinged with disbelief. "You actually did it, Sophia." She met his gaze, her expression distant. This was just one battle. The war isn't over. David studied her for a moment, then nodded. So, what now? Sophia turned toward the school gates, once a symbol of prestige, now just an empty facade. She already knew the answer. The system wouldn't collapse on its own, but she wouldn't stop fighting. She took a deep breath and walked forward, toward the future. The scandal at Callaway High had faded from the headlines, but its shockwaves still rippled through the education system. Investigations spread to other elite private schools, where flawless transcripts were now being scrutinized under the public eye. Sophia had lost her job. Her name was blacklisted from private schools across the city. Doors that once stood open now slammed shut in her face. But she had no regrets, because for the first time in years, she felt free. The Educators' Forum, 1 month later. The glow of overhead lights illuminated a vast auditorium, where hundreds of teachers had gathered. This was no ordinary conference. This was a free forum, a place where educators could finally speak without fear. On stage, Sophia stood behind the podium. No blackboard, no lesson plan, just her and a room full of people waiting to listen. She took a deep breath, scanning the faces before her. Some were young teachers, eyes filled with hope and fire. Others had stood in classrooms for decades, but their expressions were weary, skeptical. People who had seen too much failure to believe in change. Then she spoke. I used to believe that education was fair. I was wrong. The room fell silent. I believed that if students worked hard, if teachers did their jobs with integrity, then justice would naturally follow. But that's not how this system works. Fairness doesn't just happen. It has to be fought for. Some nodded, others frowned, deep in thought. Her voice grew stronger. When I stood against a corrupt system, they told me to be silent. They threatened me. They tried to destroy me. They wanted me to disappear. But if I stayed silent, if I walked away, who would be left to speak? She let the question linger, sinking into the minds of every person in the room. Then she continued. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, "Freedom is never voluntarily given. It must be fought for." A murmur rippled through the crowd. We can wait. We can lower our heads. We can say, it's not our fight. But if all of us stay silent, then injustice will never end. A shift swept through the audience. Some wiped away tears. Others gripped the arms of their chairs as if realizing something they had been too afraid to face. From the front row, David Thompson watched her, and this time, his eyes held no fear. They held resolve. Sophia smiled. Don't be afraid to speak up. Her final words rang through the hall. Before the room erupted, a thunderous applause shook the space. People rose to their feet. Some clapped so hard their hands turned red. Others shouted in agreement. Not all of them would act right away, but a seed had been planted. Outside the auditorium, Sophia stepped into the open air, looking up at the wide, endless sky. Her future was uncertain. No school to return to, no stable career waiting. But she had done the right thing. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Thank you for following this story. If you believe in justice, if you believe in truth, share this story. What do you think of Sophia's decision? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget, there are more powerful stories to come. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one.